Chronicles of the War of Souls Book Series. Book 1 Valeria, The Beginning of the End. Chapter 8. In the shadow of ancient trees, the air in Landorn was thick as a broth brewed from pine needles and damp earth, and it enveloped everything like heavy, wet silk. The silence here was not emptiness, it was a living substance, breathing in unison with the forest. The old priest, Quendeler, felt it with his skin, thin and translucent as parchment, where every bluish vein was a story, every pigment spot a memory of a year lived. He sat leaning against the white tree, and his gnarled fingers, resembling roots, traced the rough bark with a barely perceptible tremor. He was listening. This silence was louder than the trumpet calls of distant Almerian, for it consisted of the unheard hum of the universe, the cracking of bark on an ancient oak, the whisper of sap running through an ash tree's veins, the slowest, stony heartbeat of a world that remembered the first dawns. The light piercing the coniferous canopy was ghostly. Shattered into millions of emerald shards, they swayed on the resilient moss-like spots of memory, at the bottom of an ancient, forgotten consciousness, and he watched them with his weary, still keen eyes. They were not hiding. They had retreated, as nature itself retreats not in fear, but in silent, immutable knowledge of their own rightness. Their lives, once measured by the taut bowstring of imperial decrees and others' needs, now flowed slowly and majestically, like the waters of a great river spilling onto a floodplain meadow. They did not build or break. They listened, and Quendeler's heart, vast and weary as an old windskin, beat in unison with this rhythm. And in this pulsation there was no room for the rage or despair that had gnawed at him before, only an all-encompassing, all-understanding sorrow, cold and clear as water from a forest spring. He thought of how their magic, once squandered on making stone flow and water glow with a light foreign to it, had now turned inward, like a river finding an underground source and reversing its flow. Young elves, upon whose eyes still lay the shadow of a former faith, were learning from the elders not spells of power, but spells of being. They sat in circles on soft, breathing moss, placing their palms on the damp, mushroom and decay-smelling earth, trying to hear not the voice of a single stream, but the great, complex symphony of the entire forest, the interweaving of millions of lives. From the blind worm to the titanic oak, they did not command the world, they were becoming part of it again. Their dwellings, those elegant weavings of wood and will, now seemed not creations of hands, but a natural extension of the forest, its second skin. Carved balconies of pale wood were entwined with living ivy, and bridges slung between branches creaked underfoot as naturally and lonesomely as they would have without them. Everything extraneous, everything imported from the imperial era, was slowly being rejected, as a body rejects a splinter, pushing it out with the patient indifference of flesh. The last trinkets of human craftsmanship were disappearing, displaced by simple stones of whimsical shape, dried leaves, bowls fashioned from burls. Duty, once bright and clamorous, was returning to its primordial, stern, and silent form. At night, when the moon poured its ghostly, silvery light through the coniferous ceiling, they gathered in clearings. They did not sing loud songs of heroic deeds, those now seemed to them fussy and hollow, like the clatter of copper coins in Almerian's market square. Instead, they quietly, in half-voices, began ancient, wordless melodies, akin to the wind's nose in pine needles or the distant murmur of a waterfall. These sounds, born in one breast, were picked up by others, intertwined, swelled, and vibrated in the night air, merging with the forest's breath. This was not a ritual, not a prayer, but simply breath, a collective, tranquil, and infinitely sad breath of an entire people who had finally returned home to lick wounds inflicted not by enemies, but by those they had once called brothers. And in this silence, in this voluntary renunciation, lurked not weakness, but a new, terrible strength, the strength of those who had seen empires rise and die, and who knew that all roads paved with cobblestones and human pride would, in the end, be overgrown with moss. They were the last keepers of a fading world, and their silence was more eloquent than any oath sworn in the squares of Almerian. They were waiting, but they were no longer waiting for reconciliation. They awaited the inevitable finale of that distant bustle left beyond the river Arundel, behind the invisible yet unassailable wall of their sorrow and will. Yet even in this deliberate renunciation, there was no peace, for peace is the lot of the dead, and they, the children of Landorn, were alive, and their memory was alive, and the wound left by the world of men continued to seep with a quiet, unquenchable pain, like blood oozing from beneath a scabbed over but unhealed sore. The wind born on the eastern plains was a herald of plague. It brought with it not images, but smells, and they were more eloquent than any maps or dispatches. Through the fresh scent of pine needles and damp moss pierced the acrid, greasy reek of smoke, not from clean charcoal, but from burning stubble, smoldering beams. From the fires men lit themselves in their fratricide strife. Sometimes the wind carried a sweetish, sickening odor of decay from fields strewn with unburied bones, from rivers turned into graves. This wind was a language in which the East now spoke, and this language was the language of death, and everyone in Landorn understood it without translation. High Priest Quendeler, whose body with the years had become an almost weightless, transparent vessel for inexpressible sorrow, saw farther and deeper. Sitting by the white tree, he perceived not just the world's pain, but its sickness, that very fever consuming it from within. He felt the dull, insistent hum emanating from beneath the dragon's spine, from the very stony innards of the planet. This was not the work of dwarven hammers, it was a groan of the mountain itself, in whose bowels their forgotten brothers, the dwarves, waged their hopeless war. Quendeler did not know the details of the siege of Khazad-Gotol, but he felt its very essence of furious, stubborn, suicidal despair. He felt how, with each day, this war burned out of the dwarven people something vital, some last hope, leaving only bare, charred resolve to stand to the end. And he understood the terrible truth, clear and cold as a blade. The elves had retreated into silence, the dwarves into rage, and men into chaos. 3 peoples, 3 answers to the same tragedy, 3 paths leading to a dead end. At night, when the chorus of silent melodies subsided, a silence fell upon Landorn that was louder than any hum. It pressed on the ears, forcing remembrance of what one so desperately wished to forget. In this silence, the elves dreamed, that these were not dreams of past glory. They were dreams of warning. They fancied the grinding of unfamiliar, alien steel on the eastern borders, whispers from beneath the earth in the northern wastes, cold breath from beyond the ridge where creatures slept whose age was older than their own. They were not merely waiting for the end of man's bustle. Unwillingly, they were preparing. Their magic, turned inward, was condensing, crystallizing, becoming not just part of the forest, but its armor. Every tree, every stream, every stone was steeped in their will, their sorrow, their unyielding decision to preserve this last island of harmony. Landorn was no longer just a home. It had become a fortress whose walls were woven from silence, memory, and a despair as strong as dwarven adamant and as ancient as the stars, under which the great oath had once been sworn, now trampled and forgotten by all save them. The young elves, those born at the Empire's twilight and whose souls were not yet fully armored with the Elders' detachment, suffered most of all. Lyriel listened to the forest, trying to distinguish natural noises, the rustle of leaves under a pine marten's paw, the babbling of a brook from the alien grinding that might drift over the mountains. She did not fear death. She feared what that grinding would bring: memories of books burning in the library of Almerian, of the great codex shattering, of alien, core speech mangling the names of their sacred springs. The elven woman stood at the very forest edge, by the invisible wall, and listened to the wind. And she fancied in it not only smells, but sounds distant, distance distorted cries. A clangor that could be a shattered chariot falling, or the clash of swords. She closed her eyes, and before her rose not concrete pictures, but sensations. A flash of rage, a wave of fear, the chilling void of despair. She felt the world beyond the river Arundel slowly, inexorably going mad. And this madness was contagious, sticky, like black tar clinging to the soul. Among all the elves of Landorn, Lyriel was perhaps the quietest. Her silence was not the silence of wisdom, like Quendeler's, or of concentration, like the warriors'. It was the silence of a deep, personal grief turned inward, a grief she carried within her like a burden growing heavier each day. Her slender figure seemed woven from moonlight and shadows. Long silver hair, usually braided simply, spilled over her shoulders in a silken cascade when she was alone. Her face, with fine, ivory-carved features, bore the imprint of an unearthly sadness, and in her huge, almond-shaped eyes the color of spring sky lay a deep, indelible melancholy. It seemed those eyes saw not the surrounding forest, but something distant and lost. Her refuge was a high platform hidden in the crown of an ancient ash, which the elves called Landorn's Eye. From here, through a sparse canopy of leaves, opened an unmarred, magically unshielded view of the night sky. When the whole forest sank into drowsy stupor, Lyriel would climb here, wrapped in a simple cloak of silver-gray fabric, and turn her gaze to the stars, seeking in their cold, unchanging light, an answer that nothing on earth could give her. The air was cold and thick, pungent with smoke and sorrow, and it seemed the darkness itself drank in this bitterness, saturating itself like water. Lyrael stood on her high perch, offered up to the night sky, and peered into the shimmering firmament. She did not merely look, she drank in this cold light, greedily, as the thirsty drink from a stream, seeking in the relentless and ancient pattern of stars an answer she could not find on earth. Among ashes and ruins, she recognized the outlines of constellations whose names seemed to have been with her always. Since she first knew herself, they were part of her, like the beating of her own heart. A memory surfaced, the quiet, measured voice of Quendeler, and she felt herself a child again, sitting on his knees, feeling the rough weave of his robes beneath her palm. "The stars, my child," he would say, his voice like a distant chime, "are not just lights in the night. They are gods who fell asleep after the labor of creation. They wove this world from void and chaos, breathed magic into it, set its laws. And then, weary from great deeds, they sank into slumber, leaving their bodies to shine in the heavens as a reminder and a covenant." He told her that at the foot of their invisible thrones, in the hall of the unbounded, lay the Book of Being, a tome whose pages were of pure light, its script of vibrating threads of fate itself. There, in a mute and perfect pattern, was recorded the story of every living being from the first spark of consciousness to the last breath, every tear, every smile, every fall and every ascent. The fall of the Elmar Empire, the death of many thousands at the walls of Belrat, her own longing, all were but lines in a great narrative the star gods had inscribed before time began. In her youth, this knowledge filled her soul with awe and reverence. Now, it caused pain, dull and aching, like an old wound throbbing before a storm. She stared into the cold-hearted radiance, trying to read in it the world's fate, to find the slightest crack in the familiar pattern that might herald an end to this madness. But the stars remained silent and beautiful in their constancy. They shone with the same indifference when elves and men together laid the first stone of Almerion, and they shone now, when all that remained of the imperial capital was a pale, smoky shadow in human memory. "If all is predetermined," she whispered into the night, addressing the sleeping gods, her whisper like the rustle of a withered leaf, "then why give us the capacity to feel? Why this pain? Why this love, if it is merely ink on a page you, High Priest, wrote for us?" And so, when doubt became unbearable, like a noose around her throat, she came to Quendeler. He sat as always by the white tree, seeming part of the landscape, another ancient, silent being whose roots delved deep into time. "Father," she began, her voice trembling, for fear and despair tormented her soul, "if the Book of Being exists, then our suffering, is it meaningless? Are we but puppets acting out a play for slumbering gods?" Quendeler slowly turned his face, etched with wrinkles like a map of lived epochs, toward her. His eyes, deep as wells into which centuries sank, gazed upon her not with reproach, but with infinite, unending pity. "The Book of Being, my child," he uttered, each sound dropping into the silence like a pebble into a bottomless pool, "describes the river. It tells of its source, its bends, and the place where it flows into the great ocean of oblivion, but it does not dictate to the water how to flow. Every molecule, every foam on a wave's crest is free in its movement. Our will, our pain, our love, that is the water's current. The gods wrote the riverbed, but not the flow. Our fate is not a chain, but a path, and how we walk it with a song or a moan, head held high or crawling on our knees, that is our only true choice. The stars look not upon slaves, Lyrael, they look upon actors, granted the greatest freedom, the freedom to live their part as they will." Lyrael listened to his words, and something shifted in her soul, like an ice floe shifting on a river in spring. The weight of predestination did not vanish, but it no longer pressed with its former unbearable force. She climbed again to her platform and gazed at the stars. They shone as before, cold and distant, but now in their light she discerned not indifference, but expectation. They had given the world its laws, sketched the broad canvas of history, and now they watched as their creation, every elf, every human, every dwarf with its choices, its pain and its hope, embroidered upon that canvas, sewn pattern, unique and unrepeatable. And in this thought lay a new, strange hope. Perhaps the end of this play was not yet written, and perhaps their chose, quiet and desperate, to preserve Landorn was not merely a line in the book, but a bold stroke of the pen that could change everything. That night, when the wind from the east brought a particularly acrid smell of smoke mixed with something metallic and alien, Lyrael could find no peace on her platform. The air was thick, as if saturated with the smoke of distant fires, and even the stars through this veil seemed dim and frightened. She descended from the ash and went where she had not set foot for many years, to the very border of Landorn, to the invisible wall separating their eternal peace from the raging outer chaos. The road once called the Road of Friendship by the Elves was now but a pale shadow of a path, ending at the invisible barrier, where carved marble gates, once a symbol of alliance, had stood lay a pile of melted stone overgrown with pale, web-like moss. The barrier's magic was not aggressive, it was absolute. It did not burn or repel, it simply did not allow passage, and flesh met something perfectly smooth, cold, and immovable, stretching high above. Lyrael stopped 2 paces from the invisible limit. Slowly, she extended her hand, and her fingertips felt a slight but insurmountable resistance, as if touching the surface of water frozen in perfect stillness. Beyond the barrier flowed the Arundel on the far bank. The forest ended abruptly, revealing a scorched plain where, like scabs on sick earth, stood the skeletons of burned farms and charred tree husks. From there the wind blew, carrying not a smell, but the very essence of decay, the whisper of a perished world. And then she saw, not men of flesh and blood, but something else, a vision, a mirage seeping through the fabric of reality, through the veil of magic, as through cloudy glass. Shadows seethed on the horizon, a wretched, ragged procession of phantoms. They trudged westward, toward the unseen river Arundel, like blind kittens, shoving each other mindlessly, stumbling over stones of a non-existent road. She saw a phantom mother clutch a rag bundle phantom to her chest, vainly trying to shield it from a wind that could not blow. In their world an old man, leaning on a mist stick, suddenly froze and silently dissolved into nothing, and none of the other shades turned to men with empty sockets grabbed each other's throats over a half-rotted potato that melted in their smoky fingers. This was not heroism, not battle. This was decomposition itself, manifested as a mute spectacle, the slow, agonizing decay of what the Elves had once revered as a great race. Lyrael watched, and her heart, accustomed to quiet sorrow, clenched with acute, almost physical anguish. She remembered Quendelar's words about the river and its bed. These vision people were not swimming, they were choking, dashed against rocks, drowning in their own filth. And the stars, cold and indifferent, shone over this mirage, inscribing every second of this agony into their eternal book. She felt no anger, nor did she feel a desire to help. Help would have been a mockery of this echo of suffering. She felt only a chilling clarity. The barrier was needed not only to keep men out of Landorn, it was needed so the Elves would not see, once and for all, what the spirit of the world they had once tried to save had become, so that this sight would not kill in them the last spark of anything but sorrow. Suddenly, one of the phantoms, a boy of about 10, his face smeared with soot and mist tears, lifted his head and stared straight through the barrier, straight at her. His gaze was cloudy, unseeing, full of animal terror, yet directed not at her, but through her, into the very essence of Landorn, into the life, peace, and salvation he only dimly sensed. He stretched out a mist hand, his fingers clutching emptiness on the barrier's other side. Lyrael involuntarily stepped back into the shadow of an ancient pine. Her own hand still felt the barrier's cold, separating her from this mirage. The bow screamed something, but only a fragment of sound reached her, not a whir, but a lonely, desperate noise, like the howl of a wounded animal, muffled by the thickness of magic. Then his ghostly hand merged with that of another shadow woman, and he, stumbling, dissolved into the trudging crowd. Lyrael stood for a long time, until the last shadows melted into the twilight haze, absorbed by the emptiness that birthed them. The wind in Landorn did not abate, but the vision vanished, and the familiar, loud silence reigned again. But now it was different. It was saturated with that soundless scream. It hung in the air, invisible and inaudible to all but her, cutting her hearing from within, mingling with the whisper of leaves and the brooks on a phantom scar on the soul, left by an echo of another's demise. She turned and walked away from the border, back into the forest's heart. But this knowledge now walked with her, knowledge not just of chaos, but of a concrete, separate pain. The lonely cry of the boy had lodged in her soul like a splinter, and she understood the most terrible thing: their retreat, their renunciation, their quiet, wise sorrow. It was all just another form of the same madness reigning beyond the barrier. Men were going mad from action, and elves from inaction, and both these madnesses led to a dead end. A few days later, returning to the white tree, she saw Quendelar. He was not sleeping, his eyes were open and looked at her as if he had been waiting. And in his gaze she read not consolation, but the same, new, terrible understanding. They looked at each other in silence, the young elven woman and the ancient priest, who knew the futility of ages. And in this silence, something troubled and inevitable was born. The end of their quiet waiting seemed to have come. The river of fate, described in the Book of Being, was nearing a dangerous threshold, and its current was preparing to change forever. She returned to the white tree, but peace eluded her. The phantom howl of the vision boy now lived within her like a second soul, alien and intrusive. At night, when the chorus of silent melodies fell quiet, this sound gained particular power. It was not just a memory, it was a living thing feeding on her silence and growing, filling every corner of her consciousness. The sound was like a distant echo, but an echo sharp as a shard of glass lodged in the brain. It did not sound in her ears, but arose somewhere behind her eyes, in that deep place where nightmares are born and forgotten fears are stored. Sometimes it merged with the rustle of foliage, and then the whole forest around seemed to her one vast, breathing wound. She caught her lips moving soundlessly, repeating that single, inarticulate note of despair she had heard at the barrier. This howl became her personal silence, her own mute song. The gaze of Quendeler, meeting hers by the tree, had become different. In his bottomless, knowing eyes she read not consolation, but silent acknowledgement. He saw it too. Not the same vision, perhaps, but something akin, cracks in the very fabric of reality, through which the agony of a dying world seeped. His face, etched with wrinkles like a dried-up riverbed, seemed to have absorbed this new heaviness. He spoke not a word, but when their eyes met, she felt something cold and hard, like subterranean stone, sink into her very core. In this silent knowledge was nothing paternal, nothing soothing, only bare, naked truth, impossible to clothe in words without shattering something inside. His silence spoke louder than any sermon he had ever delivered under the white tree's shade. In bygone days, one night, when the moon was especially cold and indifferent, hanging in the sky like a dull, tarnished silver coin, Lyriel climbed again to her platform in the ash crown. The air was still and thick, saturated with the scent of pine and rotting earth. The moss under her feet held the damp of night. But this time, she did not seek from the stars answers about fate or free will. She looked east, to where beyond the invisible wall of the barrier lay the world of men. Her eyes, wide open, drank in the darkness, trying to discern in it anything beyond her own reflection in the magical veil. And the stars were silent. They hung in the icy heights, motionless and distant, offering neither comfort nor condemnation, only indifferent radiance over two worlds, one descending into madness through fury, the other through silence. Their light now seemed to her not a divine sign, but a simple, physical fact, as random and meaningless as a stone on a road. In this cold shimmer was neither wisdom nor purpose. And then she understood what she had not dared think before. The thought came not as an epiphany, but slowly, like encroaching cold, filling all the space of her mind. Their barrier, their sacred silence, their retreat, it was all flight. Flight from responsibility imposed by their own long lives. They had watched as children played with fire, knowing they would burn themselves, and instead of taking away the matches, had simply turned away, consoling themselves with the thought that it was so predestined. They hid behind wisdom as behind a shield, but that shield was woven of cobwebs and self-deception. They were not preserving the world, they were burying their heads in the sand, while the world burned behind them. This thought was terrible because it stripped them of their last justification, their last grain of sanctity. The thought was bitter as wormwood and heavy as dwarven stone. A bitter taste rose in her throat, dry and caustic. A weight pressed on her shoulders, as if a cloak sewn from lead and ashes had been thrown upon them. Though with it came a strange relief that the illusion had finally dispersed. It was like waking from a heavy dream, and realizing the nightmare was only a dream, only to immediately understand that the reality you've awakened into is no better. They were not wise keepers waiting out the storm. They were those who locked themselves in the farthest room of a burning house, pretending not to smell the smoke, whispering to each other that the smoke beyond the door was merely evening mist. That night she did not sing with the others. She sat alone on the platform's cold boards, legs tucked under her, back to the stars, face to the east, and listened. Listened not to the forest's song, nor the wind's whisper in pine needles, but to the silence that was louder than any hum, the silence of her own guilt and inaction. It was a silence full not of sounds, but of their absence. The absence of axe strokes building something new, the absence of children's laughter, the absence even of cries of rage and pain that would have at least been a sign of life. She listened to this voice, and it seemed as if time itself had stopped and frozen here, becoming a thin, ringing film about to snap. And when the phantom howl finally wove itself into the melody of her soul, became her own pulse, her own breath. A star fell in the east. Lyriel froze on her platform, holding her breath. The air seemed to drain from her lungs. This was no mere falling spark, not one of those small stars that sometimes streak the sky and vanish. This was a rupture. A long, mournful trail scored the sky, as if a knife had slit velvet night, leaving behind a thin, smoking wound of light, and vanished somewhere beyond the horizon, farther than those lands from which the visions came. She followed its path until her eyes ached with strain, until dark spots swam before her pupils, trying to decipher a message in this sudden vision. What was it? An omen? A symbol of someone's death? A whole people's? A whole era's? Or a sign that one of the threads in the book of being had snapped, broken under an unbearable weight, leaving behind only emptiness and a mute question? Before she could grasp it, after an interval of several heavy heartbeats she felt in her temples, and clenched fists two more broke loose. One a mighty golden-red sphere, its path clear and inexorable as a hammer blow. It tore over the very peaks of the dragon's spine, lighting the black, jagged ridges for an instant with a bloody glow, and died, leaving behind a crimson afterglow as if a giant forge had flared in the mountain's depths, and its light had pierced the stone. Lyriel felt a shudder, not physical, but internal, as if the world's stony heart convulsed, and that convulsion echoed in her own chest. Dwarves. This spoke of dwarves, of their stubborn, lonely war in the underground dark, of rage locked in stony womps and thrashing there like a trapped beast. This was the light of molten metal and ancient wrath. The second star raced south, toward warm seas, where imperial ports once bustled. Its light was cold, greenish, poisonous, like the glow of a rotten log in deep forest. It did not vanish in a flash, but seemed to dissolve in the dark, thinning, melting like sugar in water, leaving behind only an unpleasant, piercing sensation in the air, like the smell of ozone after a storm, but without its cleansing power, only a dry, acrid bitterness. To south, the former provinces of the empire, where warm seas lapped the continent with gentle waves, and now, by rumors carried by wind and rare, frightened birds, reigned a magic of a different sort, dark, cunning, full of guile and quiet, soul-corroding decay. And then the sky exploded. The silence, lasting one short, tense moment, was torn to shreds. Not one, not two, 9 stars at once tore from their places in a chaotic, frenzied dance of death. They fell out of sync, without rhythm, without order, like scattered beads from a snap string. Their glowing tails, blue, white, blood-red, crossed, weaving into an unreadable, convulsive web, a giant, mad pattern that seared the eyes. They fell north into cold wastes, west to distant seas, south and east. This was no longer an omen, no longer a symbol. This was agony, a catastrophe befalling the very heavens, the very foundations. Lyriel sprang up, her fingers digging into the rough wood of the platform railing until her knuckles whitened, and moisture seeped under her nails. The wood bit into her skin, but she felt no pain, only icy horror rising from the base of her spine. She tried to follow each falling point of light, to divine a pattern, to understand where precisely they fell, if there was any sense, any direction, any cruel logic to their fall. But it was impossible. Their trails were lost in the chaos of others, overlapped each other, creating a blinding, incomprehensible kaleidoscope of destruction. This was not a river flowing in a predicted, eternally carved channel. This was a flood, sudden and all-shattering, sweeping away all banks, all supports, all former covenants and bargains. And they, in their quiet fortress of leaves and silence, stood amid this flood, watching the sky crumble. The deep, ringing silence of Landorn, a moment ago so loud one could hear one's own heartbeat, was now crushed, flattened by this mute, all-shattering starfall. Even the phantom, soul-chilling howl of the bow, an echo of another's agony, retreated, quieted, swallowed face to face with this universal collapse. And in this moment, through a soul deafened by the spectacle, a sound reached her. Not from the sky, not from the thundering abyss, but from below, from the deepest hidden depths, from the very heart of the forest, a quiet, dry, barely audible crack, like the crunch of old bones. It came from the white tree. Lyriel slowly, as if resisting the motion, shifted her gaze from the sky, still blazing and streaked with dead lights trails, down into the gloom, to where under the shade of ancient, silent ashes stood Quendeler. He was not watching the Starfall. His gaze, heavy and intent, was fixed on the colossal, milky white trunk of the tree, and Lyriel, following his look, saw what froze the blood in her veins, turning it to icy water. From the very base of the tree, from where its mighty roots plunged into slumbering earth, up to bark, slowly, inexorably, like a poisonous shoot, stretched a thin, coal-black crack. It was not yet deep, but eerily sharp, as if a cartographer's hand had drawn an inky line on ancient, precious parchment. And the crack seemed alive, pulsing in time with her own pounding heart, and with each such pulse, with each beat, it grew slightly longer, slightly wider, slightly more visible. The falling stars were chaos up there, in the cold spaces between worlds. This was death. Death here, below. Death of Landorn itself, its soul and its covenant. The beginning of the end of their eternal, their last refuge. Lyriel lifted her eyes and saw Quendeler's face. On it was no horror, no despair, not even sorrow. Only infinite, all-encompassing, all-understanding weariness, familiar to her from old portraits of kings who had lost their wars. Slowly, with effort, as if his head were carved from stone, he raised his head and met her gaze. And in that gaze, deep as a well, she read what he would never say in words, what could not be spoken aloud. The riverbed is gone, my child, his look said. Now we are all but water in an ocean of chaos. The silence that reigned after the sky had cast out the last stars was of a different nature. It was neither peaceful nor pacifying. It was the silence of stupor, like that following a thunderclap when ears are still deafened by the roar and the world has frozen, crouched in wait for the next inevitable peal. The air, just recently thick and saturated with familiar scents of pine, damp earth, and night flowers, now carried a faint, barely perceptible, but all the more ominous smell of ozone and molten stone, the bitter aftertaste of cosmic catastrophe, born through seemingly unshakable magical barriers. Around the white tree, at whose foot yawned and breathed the sinister black crack, the elves of Landorn gathered soundlessly, like shadows on a wall by a dying fire. They came without summons, without command, moved by a single, soul-crushing feeling that pierced each of them, from youngest to oldest. Their pale, beautiful faces in the deceptive moonlight seemed carved from marble masks of mute sorrow. Warriors in worn green cloaks that still smelled of watchfire smoke, weavers whose slender fingers held the scent of bast fiber, singers whose voices, once capable of composing songs of stars' birth, now silent, all of them, from the youngest whose lives spanned mere centuries, to ancient elders, remembered Almerion's founding, looked at Quendeler and the wounded tree. They were gathered not by a word, but by a common wound. Their eternal home, their last refuge, was not merely wounded. The wound was mortal, and they felt it with their skin, their hearts, every particle of their being. And then, breaking the mute standstill, Lyriel stepped forward. Her usually quiet, soft voice seemed to have absorbed all the oppressive weight of forest silence and the metallic clang of ruptured heavens. It sounded not loud, but with such piercing, almost unbearable clarity that each word etched itself into the heart like a honed needle of ice. She spoke not as a seer foretelling the future, but as a witness come from the battlefield. She told them of her vision at the border, not of faceless chaos, not of abstract war, but of a concrete, separate, alien agony, of the phantom boy whose wide-open eyes were full of mute, animal terror, of his soundless scream that now lived in her, had become part of her soul. She told them of her terrible insight, that their retreat, their wise, proud sorrow, their detachment was the same form of madness as the rage of those left beyond the barrier. The inaction they had chosen was their own plague, their own pestilence. When she finished, a silence fell, deeper and more burdensome than before. But now it was not empty, it was thick, leaden, heavy with bitter realization slowly sprouting in every heart. For long years they had convinced themselves theirs was the only true path, the path of wisdom, patience, and waiting. And this young elven woman, whose own soul, it turned out, was as vulnerable and open to pain as their own, had shown them a bitter, relentless mirror. They were not keepers, worthily awaiting the storm's end. They were those who had hidden, who had turned away. Quendeler did not refute her. He stood, leaning slightly on his smooth, pale wood staff, and his gaze, usually turned deep into ages and through the veils of worlds, now slowly wandered over the familiar faces of his people. In his eyes was no trace of anger or desire to disprove, only that same all-understanding weariness, of which Lyrael had thought a moment before. He nodded, slowly and heavily, as if his head were filled with lead. "The river has overflowed its banks," he spoke, and his quiet, aged voice, escaping his lips, sounded louder than any battle cry or trumpet call. "The pattern of stars is torn, and its thread can no longer be woven. The crack upon the tree is no ordinary wound. It is a seam ripping upon the very body of the world. Our waiting is over. It has come to an end." The decision was born not in heated arguments, not in clashing opinions, but in that very silent accord, that deep understanding which for centuries, like underground waters, had nourished and guided their entire life. If the end of the predicted path had come, if the pages of the Book of Being had gone blank and no longer pointed the way, then the only way to understand what was happening, the only trail in outer darkness, was to turn and look into the past, to learn if such a thing had happened before, to find in the chronicles of extinguished epochs, in the records of forgotten singers, a key, a picklock to the present. And so, for the first time in long, long years, the Elves of Landorn turned not inward, not to the silence of their own hearts, but to the dusty, time-smelling folios that rested in the depths of their great library. The silence in the library was of a special kind, not the muteness of emptiness, but a thick, concentrated, living breath of ancient knowledge accumulated over centuries. The air here was cool and damp. It curled in slow spirals upward along a gigantic living trunk that served simultaneously as support, roof, and repository, and smelled not of must and mold, but of snuff candle wax, tree resin, and the pungent, sweetish pollen of plants whose dried leaves had lain between pages for centuries, preserving memory of long-past springs. Light entered through windows cut into the bark itself, light not even and dull, but changeable, playful, as in a real forest. It lay in shifting pools on the textured floorboards and on bindings of time-polished wood, upon which intricate runes lay frozen in a complex dance. They climbed the spiral staircases winding along the living trunk walls, and each step echoed with a muffled, damp thud on the porous, breathing wood pulsing with invisible life. Quendeler walked ahead, and his withered hand, fingers thin and translucent as yellowed parchment, unconsciously slid over the spines of folios embedded directly into the bark, into the living flesh of the tree. In these moments, he resembled a last dried leaf blown here by a sudden gust from other, long-vanished eras. The elves, these eternal children of the forest whose souls were woven of sunbeams and leaf whispers, touched with reverent, innate caution the bindings of tree bark can pages where ink, brewed from the dark, blood-like sap of forgotten berries, had frozen. They sought in these scrolls not merely an answer, not dry knowledge, they sought solace, an echo of former certainty, a key to unlock the door to the madness happening to the world. They craved to find a prophecy that would plainly explain why the sky was cracking at the seams, revealing an abyss, and the very earth beneath their feet groaned in mute fever. And the library, this beating heart of Landorn, this great, silent keeper, answered their mute, desperate plea. Its answer was not in thunder, not in a blinding flash, but in a quiet, insistent, almost physical summons emanating from the very top tier, where mighty branches of the gigantic ancient trunk closed tightly, forming a semblance of a natural, divine vault. The scroll they discovered there was unlike its neighbors. It rested in a recess, as if grown specifically for it in the very wood flesh, and was heavy and cold to the touch, as if woven from the finest, fused plates of dark, shimmering mica. Looking at it, one might think fragments of once bright, extinguished lights had been imprisoned and extinguished forever in its murky, layered depths. The script pressed upon its rough surface was not read in the usual way. With eyes it was felt with the skin, absorbed into the fingertips as moisture is absorbed into parched earth, and resonated somewhere deep in the bones with a dull, swelling hum, like the distant, alarming toll of an underground bell. To comprehend it, one had to run an open palm over the unwelcoming, cold plain, eyes closed, listening with one's whole being to the vibrations coming from the very thickness of the material, to vague echoes of meanings born before the world had a name, when darkness and light were one, and the scroll spoke to them. Its voice was not sound, it was like the creak of ancient, ice-covered branches in a piercing wind, the rustle of mountain rock crumbling into an abyss, the quiet, inexorable tumbling of time-polished pebbles in the black, icy womb of underground rivers. It did not sound in their ears, it manifested as a sensation, born in nerve endings, penetrating consciousness not through hearing but through the very flesh, through the vague, drowsy memory of blood that held within echoes of times when even the elves, these beautiful and sorrowful children of the world, were but a vague promise, a dim shadow in the heart of eternity. And this is what the scroll told them, in its voice like a dull hum from the planet's most secret, heated depths, when the world was still a blind thought in the heart of the great void, the true gods, whose names no tongue dares utter, opened the book of being. Its pages were woven from primordial light, its script from vibrating threads of fate itself. That the book was empty, for there was none to write the story of creation. Then the gods summoned 12 spirits, the most fierce and the most mighty. These spirits raged in the great darkness, knowing neither form nor purpose. Fire, water, earth, air, nature, metals, light, matter, time, darkness, soul, and chaos devour each other in eternal war without end. The gods offered them a great service, to gain form and become the keepers of elements, whose united wills would raise the vault of heaven and establish the firmness of earth. As reward for this service, they would become the first letters in the book of being, eternal stars in the firmament, whose light would guide all living things. Thus were born the 12 keepers, demigods, who became stars. Ignis, star of fire, his fury, bound by will, became not mere flame, but the very principle of transformation. He is the heat in the veins of a living being, the spark in the inventor's mind, the consuming cleansing pyre burning sickness from a field, and the planetary core birthing new lands in the fiery chaos of volcanoes. Without his restrained might, life would have no warmth, nor metal be born from ore. Nerea, star of waters, her essence became flow. She is the blood in the world's veins, carrying not just life, but memory. In her waters are dissolved the histories of fallen civilizations, tears of joy and despair, whispers of forgotten names. She is the gentle rain nourishing crops, the merciless flood washing away sin, and the eternal cycle linking mountain peaks to the sea's abyss. Geum, star of earth, his will solidified the shifting dust of creation. He is not just soul underfoot, but the patient, unhurried flesh of the planet. In his power lies giving harvest or opening his womb to swallow cities. He preserves the chronicle of epochs in his stone tablets, and in his dark depths countless riches and secrets that can grant power or plunge one into madness. Zephyr, star of air, he is the very breath of the world. His soul is in the whisper of leaves and the roar of a hurricane, in a newborn's first cry and a dying man's last sigh. He scatters seeds, smells of distant lands and unspoken calls, secret thoughts and unuttered words, mixing them in an invisible, eternal dance. He is the unseen mediator between all that is. Dryad, star of nature, she is the unruly, rampant force of growth. Her breath is in the sprout breaking through asphalt, the lush crown of a millennia-old oak, the complex, fragile web of life where the death of one link threatens the whole. She knows not good or evil, only endless striving for life, for filling the void with the green nose of existence. Vulcan, star of metals, he is the will to form made flesh. His hammer forged the first nuggets from chaotic ore, establishing the law of strength. He gave the world not just metal, but sword and plow, the nail holding a ship together, the crown upon a king's brow. His gift is the strength of civilization, but also its weapon, bringing both creation and destruction. Lumen, star of light, he is the source not merely of radiance, but of consciousness itself. His particles are sparks of reason, the poet's insight, the warrior's unyielding will, the threads of magic that permeate reality's fabric. He is the spark that lit the first stars and that glows in the depth of a thinking gaze, allowing not just sight, but comprehension. Morpheus, star of matter, his dominion is mutability itself. He is the principle of alchemy, of eternal transmutation. Ice becomes water, water steam, sand glass, and dead flesh dust and new soil. He reminds the world that nothing is eternal in its form, that all flows, all changes, and death itself is but a transition into another state. Chronos, star of time, he is not a tyrant, but a chronicler. His river flows in one direction, granting rhythm to all existence, the cycle of day and night, the turn of seasons, birth, flourishing, and withering. He weaves every moment, every deed into the endless scroll of being, preventing the world from freezing in eternal now or crumbling into disjointed instants. IMMERSE, star of darkness, he is the keeper of absence. His domain is not evil, but rest, silence, oblivion, and mystery. He is the soothing night granting respite from the furious day, the silence of caves preserving ancient secrets, the womb receiving souls burdened by life. He is the necessary pause in the great symphony of existence, Animus, star of souls, he is the spinner of lives. From scattered sparks of being, he weaves the unique patterns of individual souls, instilling in them the thirst for life, the capacity for grief and joy, for love stronger than death, and for hope shining even in utter darkness. He breathes life into clay and takes it back when the path is done, keeping eternal account of all hearts that have ever beat. Erebus, star of chaos, his sacrifice was the greatest of all. He agreed to direct his element toward creation. His power is the engine of chance, unpredictability, mutation. Thanks to him, a child may be born a genius, and an unknown flower may sprout in a trampled field. He introduces into the rigid framework of creation an element of the unpredictable, of creative disorder, without which the world would become a static, dead mechanism. Each of them, accepting their role, became a star in the firmament and a line in the book of being. While their stars burn, the river of fate flows, or their light shines, creation stands. When the last echo of the tale faded in the cold depths of the mica plates, the elves stood in stunned silence, and it seemed the silence itself absorbed the meaning of what they had heard. They looked at the crack on the white tree, the earthly embodiment of Dryad, and now, at last, grasped the full immeasurable horror of what was happening. The falling of stars from the sky, the world's sickness, the black crack upon the heart of their home wall meant one thing, and this knowledge was heavier than any lead. The silence in the great library of Landorn thickened, became dense and viscous, like old honey stored for decades in sealed clay jars and now spilled out, filling the space between shelves and scrolls. The air, just recently filled with the warm, familiar aromas of wax, tree resin, and dried herbs, now held the cold of metal and the sharp, acrid tang of ozone, as if after a distant but immensely powerful storm whose echo had traveled here through time. The light that once streamed through the cunning windows in the bark, tainting intricate patterns of dust and time itself upon the floor, now seemed faded, sickly, as if looking at them through a thickness of murky, stagnant water. Lirael stood leaning against the rough, living wood of the wall, feeling beneath the thin fabric of her cloak its uneven, eternal breathing, a weak pulsation that was the music of this place. Her fingertips unconsciously, as if seeking solace and support, traced the carved, time-blackened symbols our ancestors had etched into the bark millennia ago. She felt with her skin the roughness of each sign, each stroke of her people's history, as if reading a blind script of fate. The mica plates of the ancient scroll lay upon a low table of whimsically intertwined roots, and their ghostly, greenish shimmer, once steady and mesmerizing, now resembled the faltering, weakening pulse of a dying thing. Quendelor stood motionless in the very center of the hall, and in his silence seemed yet another ancient tree in this forest of wisdom and memory. His face, usually calm and filled with serene, eternal sorrow, was pale, almost translucent like the thinnest porcelain. In his eyes, those deep wells into which whole epochs sank, was reflected not the familiar forest gloom or the calm flame of a hearth, but the cold, detached, and merciless light of distant, alien constellations. "They are leaving," said Lirael, and her voice, quiet and clear, sounded in the tomb-like silence of the library with such piercing clarity that some of the gathered elves involuntarily shuddered, as if touched by a blade. The air in the library seemed to freeze completely, ceasing even to vibrate with the usual, soothing whisper of leaves beyond the walls. The silence became palpable, heavy, pressing on ears and soul. Quendelor slowly, with difficulty, as if every movement caused him inexpressible, ancient pain, turned his head. His gaze, dull and weary, slid over the pale, troubled faces of his gathered kin, only to sink once more into the shimmering script of the scroll. "The stars are falling," he pronounced, each syllable dropping into the silence like a heavy, time-polished stone into the waters of a bottomless, black lake. "The ancients are abandoning their celestial thrones. They renounce." Wide, burst a choked, despairing whisper from one of the young elves. In his voice was not just fear, but a breaking, the shattering of an entire world, all the foundations upon which he had been raised. Quendelor did not answer. He only looked at the scroll, and it seemed he was reading not what was pressed upon the cold mica, but what lay between the lines, the unspoken, inexpressible, and therefore even more terrible. Lirael took a step forward, her cloak of finest silver-gray fabric, woven from bast fibers and moonlight, stirred, breaking the air's stillness. Every sound, the rustle of cloth, her own even breathing echoed in the ringing silence louder than the beat of war drums. She stood for a few moments, feeling upon her the weight of her kin's gazes, their fear, their hope, their doubt. The air in a library was thick, as if saturated with expectation and ancient dread. "I will go east," she said, the word sounding like an echo of a long-made, inexorable decision, "to where the first star fell and went out." In her voice was no trace of uncertainty, only the cold, honed clarity of necessity. She turned and moved toward the exit, her silver-gray cloak swaying with her resolute steps. "Beyond the spine," she added, already reaching the massive, oak-carved door, "to where the wind brings the smell of smoke and scorched pain. Do not hurry." Gwendolyn raised a hand, and this simple gesture, imbued with ancient, indisputable authority, stopped Lyrael on the very threshold. It seemed the very silence of Landorn, its very soul, had coalesced around his thin, almost transparent fingers. Lyrael froze, not turning. Her back was tense as a bowstring, fists clenched so tightly her nails dug into her palms. She felt the bitter truth in his words, but the phantom, soul-chilling howl of the bow still rang in her ears, demanded action, immediate and furious. Not old, cautious wisdom. "We retreated once, to survive," Gwendolyn continued, and in his voice, usually sorrowful, sounded for the first time not sadness, but something firm, unbending, like dwarven stone in mountain depths. "That survival devoid of purpose and meaning is merely a slow, shameful death. You are right in one thing, my child, our inaction has become our plague, our curse. But reckless, blind impulse is a poison that will kill you, giving the world no answers." He slowly, majestically, looked over the gathered elves. His gaze, heavy with the knowledge of thousands of years, slid over the young, smooth faces bearing the shadow of unspoken turmoil, over the elders in whose eyes lay the same weariness as his own, but also a spark of long-forgotten, slumbering courage. "Let it not be a lone arrow that journeys into the darkening lands," proclaimed the high priest, and his quiet, aged voice suddenly acquired a power capable of piercing any silence and any doubt. "But let a small, honed blade, forged of common will, probe the darkness encroaching upon the world. We know not what awaits beyond the barrier. A sickness devouring men? A new threat that casts the stars from their heavenly thrones? Or something else, of which even the oldest scrolls do not speak and the wisest singers do not sing?" He looked again at the elven woman, and now in his gaze, deep and calm, as the waters of a forest lake on a windless day, was not a request nor an order, but silent trust and all the unbearable weight of responsibility placed upon the chosen one. "Go, Lyrael," he spoke, and each sound of his voice was minted for ages. "But go not as an outcast bearing in her heart only her own pain, but as our gaze turned toward the world beyond the barrier. Find those whose hearts, like yours, find no more peace in our silence, whose souls hear the same desperate call coming from beyond the blue mountains. They will come to you, I know, for in the hour when the white tree cracked, not only old fears awaken, but an ancient, forgotten duty as well." Gwendolyn's words did not simply hang in the air. Filled with the scent of ancient dusk-tanned tree resin, they changed its very essence, its density. The pressure of eternal, tacifying sorrow that had lingered under the library's vault suddenly eased, yielding to a new, anxious and bitter electricity, that very smell of a storm before a tempest, that can no longer be waited out in shelter, for the very fortress has cracked. Lyrael slowly turned to him, and light from a window in the bark fell upon her face, drawing her resolute features from the half-dark. She nodded, briefly and clearly, without extra words. Her mission was not cancelled, no. It was transformed, as a stream is transformed flowing into a full river. From a lone, desperate impulse, it became the work of all Landorn, its hand extended into the dark. In the following days, which dragged on slowly and anxiously, at the very foot of the white tree, near the yawning, breathing black crack, like shoots after a long winter, elves began to appear. They came alone and in silence, stealing through morning mist or in the crimson rays of sunset. Not by order of the elders, not from a sense of duty prescribed in ancient scrolls, but by the call of their own, unquenched anxiety gnawing them from within, giving no rest. There were few of them, only a handful, a fistful of seeds cast onto scorched, barren earth. They did not form neat ranks, did not give loud, pompous oaths, did not raise banners. They simply gathered, exchanging brief, understanding glances in which was read a common, unspoken knowledge. Their path led to a place from which there was no return, to where the river of fate ended and the boundless, unknown ocean of chaos began. And when Lyrael came out to them at dawn, clad for a long journey in a simple, gray, unadorned cloak, with a smooth ash bow on her back and with that very phantom scream forever dwelling in her heart, She saw not a military unit, not a militia, but a living reflection of her own resolve in a dozen pairs of eyes, eyes in which the former, blessed peace of Landorn was no more, but in which had kindled a dangerous, uncharted, like to first step into an abyss, hope. Quendeler watched them from the high threshold of the library, and his motionless figure merged with the shadows swirling in the doorway. He did not bless them nor speak parting words. He simply watched, absorbing into his ancient, much-seen soul the image of this small handful of volunteers, leaving the fortress of silence and peace to meet the swelling roar of a perishing world. His last, long look met Lyriel's gaze, and in it was no fear, no parental approval, only bottomless, all-understanding sadness and a quiet, almost extinguished, yet unquenchable flame of expectation. The blade had been honed by their common will and common pain. Now it was to prick the very heart of the advancing darkness, to learn if it still beat, and what it was made of. The journey that was to change, if not the world, then themselves, had begun. Thank you for your attention. Please like and subscribe so you don't miss the next part and chapter.